Well, thank you for coming out. I have not been out since about 4 o'clock, so I take it it's somewhat torrential out there, or it's a healthy rain. So thank you for coming out this evening. I wanted to begin with a more general introduction, thanking the many, many good people who have helped to launch this year's Babcock lecture and event series. I'm gonna this time around content myself, though it leaves me, a little discontented, simply with naming the individuals who have been so critically helpful, and not embedding their names in a prose description of what they've done. But I don't want this second conversation to begin without a proper acknowledgement. So again, this lecture series actually arguably was inaugurated in 1941 with a generous gift from Cora A. Babcock, who was a graduate of Hartwick Seminary. Many good people, however, collaborated and supported this year's effort. And so Doctors Douglas Kendall and Quentin Lewis with the exhibit at the museum, Steph Rocknack, who has been here for both lectures this evening, the renowned sculptor whose Poe returning to Boston sculpture is at Boylston and Charles Streets. She donated the clay mock-up of Poe's head to the exhibit. And so she has been importantly involved as well. Professor David Cody offered commentary at a screening of Federico Fellini's Toby Dammit, 1968 film version of Poe's story. The archivist Rachel Gleiberman, marketing and strategic communications Gail Glover, Stephanie Brunetta, Nick George, our various repasts, Darlene Kopf, book signing, Jessica Fox, room setup, James Cummings, Richard Borgreen, tech, media, Chris, the ever-reliable Chris Spiewak, and Heather Conroe oversaw administrative matters. Dr. Laurel Bongiorno, the president-elect of Hartwick College, made sure that the funding was available to launch this important event. And I would also like to acknowledge Dr. James Mullen and Mary Mullen, who have been with us devotedly, strategically, indefatigably as we push into our future, and have been a part of this Babcock event as well. We will miss you, and Finley. And finally, David Cody has been importantly involved from the beginning as well. So thanks to one and all. I'm thrilled that Stephan Loewentheil is with us this evening. Long before I had met him, I had encountered the name Stephan Loewentheil, who is something of a legend in the rare book and historic photography world. Of the descriptions that or the descriptors that have been applied to him, antiquarian, philanthropist, purveyor of rare books and photographs, stolen book sleuth, perhaps the most accurate is that bestowed by Anne Kenny, Carl A. Kroc, university librarian at Cornell University, who has dubbed Stephan a super collector, someone who has, quote, excelled in unearthing obscure bibliographic details, leading to the acquisition of underappreciated rarities, seminal documents, and early historic photographic images. Born in Brooklyn and raised in New Rochelle, New York, Stephan Loewentheil attended Washington and Jefferson College, from whence, as he tells it, he, quote, graduated after 3 years of cultural shock with a bachelor's degree and honors in history. In 1975, he graduated from Cornell Law School, after which, again, as he himself puts it, he, quote, escaped from the practice of real estate law in order to devote himself to the management of a historical neighborhood restoration and redevelopment project in Baltimore, Maryland. During this time, he was collecting rare books, refining an expertise he had been developing since his mid-20s. In 1984, Stephan became the founder and president of the 19th Century Rare Book and Photograph Shop in Baltimore, to which a second shop located in the Flatiron district of New York City was added. In 1992, Stephan published the Poe Catalog, a comprehensive bibliography of one of the world's most significant private collections of Edgar Allan Poe materials, that significant private collection being Stephan's own. In 2009, Stephan was awarded an honorary membership by the Poe Studies Association for his contribution to Poe scholarship. In addition to Poe, Stephan developed an interest in collecting the works of other shapers of intellectual history: Copernicus, Sir Thomas More, Frederick Douglass, Charles Darwin, Walt Whitman, and Albert Einstein, for example. And then there is someone whom Stephan has described as incomparably the greatest writer in the English language and one of the most important international cultural influences in all history. That is the bard, William Shakespeare. On October 14, 2020, Stephan was one of 3 telephone buyers at Christie's, New York, who engaged in a 6-minute bidding battle to secure a copy of the 1623 complete first folio of comedies, histories, and tragedies by William Shakespeare. Stephan prevailed, his winning bid making this the most expensive printed volume of literature sold at auction to date. Through his literary studies, Stephan became curious about what 19th century thought leaders looked like. He began collecting photographs in order, as he put it, to feel closer to them, and eventually expanded into collecting daguerreotypes, carte de visite, albumen prints, tintypes, and cyanotypes. Since 2011, Stephan has established significant photography collections at several institutions of higher learning, including his alma mater, Cornell University, and the University of Pennsylvania. Collections devoted, for example, to Matthew Brady and the Civil War, to Native Americans and the West, to African American life from 1860 to the 1960s. His aim in thus establishing these collections has been to preserve and transmit historical and cultural knowledge. As he himself has said, part of my role is to help important institutional libraries recognize the need to focus on this imagery from earlier times, bridging our digital image-saturated age and the time when photography was first perfected and used as a mode of transmitting knowledge. Like Goya's Chronos, I have been devouring Stephan's time in an attempt to take the measure of his stature and reputation in the world of antiquarian enterprise. Let me then step aside and let Stephan narrate his own tale. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to the second of today's Babcock speakers, super collector extraordinaire, Stephan Loewentheil.
Well, after that introduction, I think I'll just close the book and let you live with that. But I do want to rely on all of our previous speakers and join them in thanking everyone involved in bringing me here. The whole Hartwick community living, and as far as Mr. Babcock goes, dead, made this evening possible, and I thank you. So I will say a few things. One thing I do want to say, there was a quotation up there about early photography and modern transmission of knowledge. And I have a pet theory, and I'm only going to say 2 sentences on it, which is that the invention of replicable photography will be looked at in the long term of history as the beginning of the transmission of knowledge through electronic means. It is the change from the written to the visual that is going to make the biggest impact in society moving forward. And I think there's a great doctoral thesis for any of your students who wants to trace that change from paper negatives into the computer age. I think it's a very interesting thought. Nevertheless, since you've all heard about what I've done, all I can do is tell you how I happened into it, and I will try to keep it relatively brief. Book collecting has been variously described as an obsession, an occupation, a disease, an addiction, a fascination, an absurdity, and a fate. But one thing is clear, it's not a hobby. Those who do it must do it, and many of us find remarkable personal obsession with particular authors. And for some reason, Edgar Allan Poe is one of those authors that seems to grab people and control their lives. There's a wonderful contrast you've seen tonight about Poe's influence on people. Take Richard, who is a distinguished scholar, has created a work that will literally live forever in his biography of Poe, and how he was influenced to become a scholar. And now you're going to hear how myself, not a scholar at all, had a very different life, equally a result of my fascination with Poe. Many years ago, when I was a young book dealer, I published a thin volume called the Poe Catalog, which was an attempt to organize his various publications in literary magazines and annuals in some kind of chronological and relevant order, in addition to the better-known works which I had scraped together over many years to create my own personal collection, and this was the result of it in 1992. I wrote, "The experience of assembling this collection introduced me to the world of book collecting, then bookselling, which changed my life. Now, over 30 years later, I can truthfully say that getting to know Poe and the scholars and collectors who share my fascination was one of the most influential events of my life. But I'm jumping too far ahead of my relationship with Poe. Many years ago, when I was in college, a small liberal arts college, much like where we are today, I met an American literature professor named Dr. James Gargano, who suffered through educating me into the mysteries of Poe addiction. We met at a small college, indeed the first college west of the Alleghenies. That was our claim to fame, Washington and Jefferson College. Dr. Gargano, already a distinguished Poe scholar and biographer, gave fascinating lectures which extended my interest. I eventually decided that I would pursue Poe, and in the mid-'80s, while in New York, I visited an auction house seeking to buy a first edition of Edgar Allan Poe's book, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which eventually had a great effect on Richard as well. It's another parallel story. It was Poe's only novel, and the estimate was $200. It was my first significant purchase. I scraped together my money, walked into the auction room, and decided I would do it. As I awaited the Poe volume, a lot containing a bill for medical services from William Harvey came to the auction floor. To my absolute amazement, this small document from Mr. Harvey relating his discovery of circulation of the blood brought $7,000. It struck me as a great deal of money for an autograph, and I tucked it away in my mind and said, those people are crazy. No one who studies Poe should call anyone else crazy. Several years later, I was in England on vacation, and I went to buy the English edition of Pym to put with my American edition of Pym. And as fate had it, there was a nearly identical manuscript from Harvey in the auction. However, it had been torn. But wise enough to recognize fate, because of the tear, the bidding floundered. Nobody in England wanted a torn manuscript. And in those days in the auction rooms, when they were less powerful, they used to go backwards if they couldn't get their bid. So I sat there, and it went 7,000, 6,000, 5,000. When it hit £1,000, I put my hand up for absolutely no good reason. Hammer went down, and I was the new owner of a Harvey manuscript. Well, I had no idea what to do with it. I knew nothing about it, but I did have the sense to look up who had bought the last copy of De Motu Cordis, figuring if they had spent $30,000 for the book, they would certainly buy my manuscript. And as luck had it, the buyer was Jake Zeitlin. Little did I know that he was one of the great booksellers in America towards the end of his career, all the way across the country in Los Angeles. And Jake had been a force for 50 years. I wrote him a letter. We didn't have email in those days, and I was too scared to call him. I wrote him a letter, and I said, Jake, I know you bought the last copy. I know you paid $30,000. I know you sold it. I bought my manuscript for $1,000. I saw it sell for $7,000. I'm going to send it to you. Send me half the profits. Well, what do you know? 3 weeks later, I got a check for $2,500, the easiest money I ever made in my life, and I said, there may be something to this book business. So I wrote him again, and I said, Jake, I'd like to come and visit you. I figured I'd wheedle my way in there and learn something. Well, it turned out he was smarter than me. He was in his late 70s. He wanted to sell his business, and he figured he had a sucker on the line. So I went out there. He welcomed me into his shop on La Cienega Boulevard, right across from the fancy eateries, an old barn, a book barn. And he said to me, this is a wonderful occupation, and I can tell you'd be great at it. I'm thinking about selling. Are you interested? I said, Jake, I just met you. I have no idea. He said to me, well, give it some thought. So I went inside, and the inside were shelves 25 feet high, filled with the most beautiful books I had ever seen. And I said, Jake, what a fabulous and valuable stock you have here. I could never afford this. He looked me in the eye and he said, Stephen, the fabulous books will sell, rarely lasting 6 months. You're looking at 50 years of mistakes and residue from collections where I have my money out for decades, and now they're decoration. Don't make the same mistake. Don't buy books that you don't think you'll be able to sell someday. And then he said, you're missing something. The value of my business is not my leftover books, which are transitory. 2 other locations. One is in my head, where my experience and my clients reside. And the second are the shelves of my reference library, where the knowledge is held. Jake directed me to purchase and memorize the catalog of the Great Wakeman Sale of American Literature of 1919-1921, which had collections of the best-loved American authors of that period collected. Among them was Edgar Allan Poe. I bought that catalog, and I slept with it. I read it at night, and I read it in the morning. For years, this was my template for building collections and building the Poe collections. And I was inspired in my modest way to follow it. I've been very important through collecting to learn that it's the great objects, the great writings that are worth owning. And over the years, I learned that if you have great books, the great clients and institutions will come to you. If you have moderate books, you'll live with them like Jake did for 50 years on your shelves. An important lesson. After about 10 years, my business began to mature. I began to learn something. And books from our inventory began to reside in the permanent collections of great institutions, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Shrine of the Book in the Jerusalem, the Library of Congress, and many others. They've also found their way into the private collections of world leaders, such as Dalai Lama, Pope John Paul II, Benjamin Netanyahu, Mikhail Gorbachev. How did this happen, you might wonder? Well, that's how it happened. I was doing a booth at an antiquarian antique show in Manhattan, and a distinguished-looking man walked into the booth, he looked carefully at my volumes, my precious little tomes that I had there. And then he introduced himself. He said, "I am Ambassador Joseph Verner Reed, Chief of Protocol to George W. Bush." He said, "I'm coming from a long family of book collectors." I had no idea what he meant. Later I learned that he lived in an 18th century house in Connecticut, which had a 5-generation book collection from the days of the American Revolution. And he had decided that in his capacity, working with Bush, rather than giving out trivial gifts, he thought the president should give out books as official gifts to visiting heads of state. He said, "Would you like that job?" I said, "Are you kidding me? That's a dream." And he said, "Well, here's your first challenge." He said, "The White House is soon going to entertain Mikhail Gorbachev. He's coming to the White House, and we need a book to give him." I thought, what do I know? I don't know much about him, but I know he's trying to start a new government over there in Russia. So how about picking Marshall's Life of George Washington? Let him think about creating a government. And I got the first edition of that. I offered it through Verner Reed to George Bush, and they were thrilled. They were delighted. And that began my relationship with the White House. Over the years, that relationship continued. President Mitterrand got Charles Baudelaire's French translation of Poe. President Clinton's gift to Pope John Paul II from me was Kittel's Specimens of American Poetry, an early collection of American poetry, because the Pope was an amateur poet. And the key principle was to find foreign leaders something that would resonate with their internal book addiction with American history. This continued for many years, up until the Obama administration, where we began working with books, but President Obama had such a varied background of interest that he began giving away other treasures like Dallas cowboy jackets and things like that. But anyway, I do want to share one story about my White House relationship. On the morning of February 27th, 1996, I received a call from Betty Curry, who I had come to know, who was Bill Clinton's private secretary, and she said to me, "We have a crisis." And I said to myself, what crisis could the United States government have that I could be any help? It didn't make any sense to me. And I said, she needed my assistance. It was Chelsea Clinton's 16th birthday, and things were very rocky in the Clinton house those days. And she said to me, "The president has been distracted by other pressing matters, and he hasn't yet bought his daughter a birthday present." She said, "Don't worry, we don't need it till 4 o'clock this afternoon." "What don't you need till 4? She said, "That's your job. My job is to keep the president happy." So I knew that the president was a very well-read man and that he wanted his children to be classically educated. And I had a stroke of bookseller genius. I realized that Milton had written a very, very important polemic on a free press called Areopagitica. And I realized that the idea of a free press might resonate with Chelsea at this particular moment in time. So I found a beautiful set of Milton's collected works. I wrote a description, not focusing on Paradise Lost, Paradise Regained, but focusing on the great essay, Areopagitica. I went home, changed that of my T-shirt into something more appropriate, ran down to the White House. I was greeted by the Secret Service, who was expecting me, and after passing me through metal detectors and psychological examinations, I was led into Betty's office. I had the full beard then. They couldn't deal with it too easily. And her office was at literally the doorway to the president. And you didn't get to see the president without Betty passing you on. Now, she had invited me, but she didn't know me that well, and she was a little bit nervous also. So she decided to make sure I was a sane individual without any nefarious intentions. So she asked what I had brought, and I told her the story of Milton and the church and the need for Areopagitica, and she said, "Man, that's pretty clever." She then went into the office, brought Bill out so that he could look me over, and decided if he wanted me dismissed, be rid of me, or if he might want to chat with me for a minute. Well, I was astonished, but I shouldn't have been, to find out that Bill Clinton knew all about Areopagita, and he knew all about John Milton, and that he was one smart president. And I had met some dumb presidents in my day. So he invited me in, and then he said, the press has been a bit of an issue for Chelsea and I recently, and I do think this is a wonderful choice for a gift. We then went into the Oval Office where we discussed Milton, our life as parents. We had children of similar ages. He was extraordinarily candid to a point. And then he posed for a little picture with me, and he was smart enough to angle it so you could not see the 14-inch disparity in our height. He's a very clever man. So then he buzzed for Betty again, and he said, Betty, I want you to take care of this guy. And that meant get me the signed pictures and send it to me. And then we got a call several weeks later from Betty Curry saying that the president had asked her to invite my wife and I to a dinner in the White House. Now, my mother-in-law happens to be a tough old lady. She was married for 50 years to the dean of NYU Medical School and had very high ideas of their social importance. The only time I ever outdid her was going to this dinner in the White House, which left her gasping in amazement and was worth all the trouble I went to. Now for the best part of this whole story. Years later, I was enjoying a meal on the Upper West Side of New York when Chelsea walked in, and I hadn't seen her directly at the time, except at the dinner. I had been introduced to her briefly. And she walked by, I stood up, I said, I'm Stephan Loewentheil. She looked at me, she looked at my beard, and she said, I know who you are. She said, you're the one who brought me that Milton book back in the day. And she said, I think you'd be interested to know that stimulated me. And over the years, I've become interested in other political tracts written by other influential essayists. And one of my favorites is Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. I was thrilled. First, I was surprised and honored at the fact she remembered me. And then I was pleased that my choice of books had influenced her education and her interest as a young bibliophile. The moral of the story is that the role of book dealing transcends that of selling books, but it's to usher collections and readers in a direction to reflect their life's potential experience and future passion so that collectors can discover their own path guided by the great riches of the book world. It can be said that many intellectual voyages are started by a great book that planted the seed in an open mind. I've often described my role as a link in a long chain of people who love things of intellectual significance, and my job is to pass it from one generation to the next generation, taking a small percentage on the way through. Speaking of great books, Mr. Clinton's thank you note, which was quite nice, obtaining the Milton set. I know you've gone a great deal of trouble for us, and it means a lot to me. What the next line, which he didn't put in there, is, my daughter Chelsea's talking to me again. But we'll let that go for now. Speaking of great books, I've been fortunate enough to deal with amazing, important, and rare objects. The first great book I handled outside of the American canon, which I knew, was a copy of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species. All of Darwin's books were first published in a green cloth publisher's binding, and all of them are virtually identical, except for the stamping of the name and the date on the cover. In a small auction in England, I came to read hundreds of auction catalogs a month. There was an example of a Darwin first edition in brown cloth, and the assumption by many people, everybody almost, was that it had been rebound. But I looked at the binding and I noticed that the stamping on the spine was totally and absolutely identical to the traditional green Darwins. So I decided I'd take a chance. I went out, put my bid in, got on the telephone, and I won the book. Now, here I have a book that I'm convinced is the most valuable Darwin in the universe, and I have no way to prove it. So at that time, the great Darwin scholar and bibliographer Robert Freeman was late in his career at the University College in London. He was the unchallenged dean of Darwinism. So I called him. I said, Mr. Freeman, I've got an oddity here. It's a brown-bound Darwin. He said, there are no brown-bound Darwins. I said, yeah, there are, and I'm holding it. I said, I'd like to bring it to show it to you. And I described it to him, and then he wisely said, I'm not going to give you any blessing over the telephone. If you really believe it, come to England and show it to me. So he advised me that when I got to London, I could easily find his office, which was adjacent to that of Jeremy Bentham. I said, is this guy out of his mind? Has he crossed the bridge of senility? What's going on here? I was completely bewildered. The only Bentham I knew had died in 1832. Yet, Freeman clearly told me when I arrived I should seek out Mr. Bentham, who was just down the hall from him. So I did. And when I got there, I found Mr. Bentham mummified in a glass case in the hallway. He gave me a bit of a fright, but I realized that though Dr. Freeman may have been aging, his sense of humor was still intact, as was Mr. Bentham's, who had left this as his own memorial to himself in the halls outside of his office. Freeman was thrilled to examine the brown Darwin. I wasn't quite as thrilled to examine Jeremy Bentham, frankly. But he did eventually authenticate it as a trial binding, and the mystery remains to this day of for whom or why this original brown binding was done. This became my first great triumph. I went to a very well-known book collector who wouldn't have given me the time of day, but when I sent him a picture of the book and a copy of the letter from Bentham, he invited me out to his home, stay the weekend, love to get to know you. And I learned something there, which is that two things. First, the greatest scholars in the world are always interested to share their wisdom if you have something they don't know about. Always. And to this day, when we have a question, we go to whoever is the best expert in the world, because people know a lot in their narrow fields, as Richard has probed. No one knows more about Poe than Richard, and no one knows more about many individual things. I could tell you scores of stories, including a letter written by Christopher Columbus and published when he needed to get money from the Pope and the Queen, but that's another story. The second thing I learned was that if you have a great object, great collectors will want you. Oh, we got to go back. You already have heard, about my experience with Shakespeare. I think that Shakespeare is probably the greatest literary genius who ever lived. The fact that we're talking about him today, 500 years after his death, is somewhat of a tribute. The fact that 2 or 3 of his plays are always in the West End or in New York City, and people flock to see him. So to my mind, ownership of this book is critical to anyone who's building a very great collection. And since there are not that many of them, I have learned over the years, that people with far more money than I will pay a premium to own important things. And I also know something that librarians and university presidents know, that private collections are the doorway to public institutions. That without private collectors, no public library, no great institution could survive. We are the ones who lay out the money on the table to get things, and then in due time, since none of us live forever, these things get passed to the great libraries, and every great librarian and university president will tell you that's the secret to building a great institutional library. During the years of my life, I've owned many great Poe items. His own annotated copy of the Tales of Grotesque and Arabesque. His presentation copy of Poems and Tales to Sarah Helen Whitman in his own hand, specially bound. This was my favorite of all the Poe books that I ever owned, and I've had the wonderful luck to own it twice. I got it back from the first guy I sold it to, and then I was able to sell it to a second client. This is an important lesson, like the Darwin, this book. Like they say in the quotation, famous quotation in The Field of Dreams, if you build it, they will come. If one builds a shop filled with important books, the great clients will find us. They'll come beating down our door. They'll invite us to their home. They'll send their private plane, only if you have something they want. So, this brought me close to the hearts of great collectors, so I'll leave you with two thoughts. One never knows where the interesting paths of literature will take you, from Washington, PA, to the Washington White House, to the greatest of collectors, to the presidents of many countries. I have been very fortunate in establishing remarkable friendships, and it all started with Edgar Allan Poe and those fascinated by him. It's been a great journey from Washington, Pennsylvania. I was happy to escape it at the time, but now I realize it too held a place in my growth. Humility. That's what I learned at Washington Jefferson College. I have many more stories, but we'll hold those for another day. But I never forget my debt to Edgar Allan Poe for my career in the book world and the remarkable friendships and experiences which followed. Thank you.
At this point that perhaps we would have a mediated discussion among the various Babcock speakers and presenters. I'm wondering, though, with this sort of intimate audience, whether we might just field questions among ourselves. Does that seem like a good idea? I think they will be.
You know, I want to say something. First of all, I thoroughly enjoyed that. It was really wonderful. And I could hear stories like that for a month or whatever. Yeah. So just as a footnote to something, to tie this into a Hartwick context, I believe, I recall anyway, and I may be incorrect, but I think Bentham left money to that college in London. And he is in a glass case. And they mummified him, but he had a theory that you would, if you were a really famous person, you should be, when you died, you should be basically coated with caoutchouc and shellacked and varnished and then put up on a pedestal so you could stand there forever. He called it auto-icon. You would be your own sculpture, basically, which has been a theme in horror films, as a matter of fact. Anyway, he left money, but with the proviso that he would be wheeled in to the board meetings every year at the college, and he would preside over the meeting. So I'm not suggesting this necessarily as a tradition we could start at Hartwick, because hopefully all of our presidents and ex-presidents will be alive in perpetuity, but it's an interesting concept to think about. Yeah. Anyway. Yep. He is quite shocking.
Collect anything that you won't sell?
Children.
Children?
I have a collection of 3 and 4 grandchildren that I wouldn't sell. My attitude on this is actually, you may find it interesting. I believe that I'm going to die, likely, and I won't be able to take it with me.
Yeah.
So it's just a matter of how long I want to keep it on that chain of things. There are some things I have and do have that I've kept a very long time. But what happens is every so often I meet a person or an institution where I feel, well, gee, I'm going to have to give it up sometime, and this is somewhere where it belongs. I'm a very strong believer in putting things where I think they can do good or belong. Then they have to meet my price. That's another subject.
Right.
Sometimes we give gifts. At Cornell, I've given them a lot of photography because I think that it was formed in the Civil War. So for them to have documentation of the Civil War era is extremely, extremely important. But there's nothing that I own that, unless one of my children wants to claim something of mine, most things I move on. Most children don't really want what their parents collected. I've learned that. over decades of selling to people. And it's not that they want the money, but they have their own interests. So that's the answer to that. I have one or two things that I'm holding on to. I'm particularly fascinated by the Apollo 11 trip to the moon. I think in the long run, almost as much and maybe more than World War II, that is the greatest American accomplishment. And I have some objects that went to the moon with Armstrong and the Apollo 11, including a spoon from the moon, including a large flag that they brought with them, and many written documents. Those things I have kept, and eventually I hope my children will take some of them, but the others I'll find an institution for, because people don't realize how spectacular that. We still can't do it again. No. Nobody could do it. The Chinese are trying it. And in the long run of history, which I like to think about, that's the opening of the extraterrestrial universe, and he will be remembered 100 times more than Columbus. And he didn't use smallpox.
Okay.
Just to be clear, Chris and I are thrusting mics at people because it's being live streamed, so it's easier for people outside. It's not that this room we couldn't hear one another.
Thanks. That was great. That was, yeah. You mentioned Columbus when you were there, the letter, and you said it's for another time. I wonder if right now is the
I'll tell
other
you
time?
briefly that story.
Yeah.
Christopher Columbus, as we all know, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And what we all probably in this room know is he did not get to America. He got to the Caribbean. And when he got there, he was sent by the crown, Ferdinand and Isabella, to get gold, and by the church to get souls to save. Sadly, none of them were there. Very little gold and no souls that wanted to be saved. So eventually he had to turn around and go home, and on that trip, he's saying to himself, like any reasonable explorer, how am I going to get them to send me back? I have nothing. So he wrote a letter, which is known as the Columbus letter, which he sealed into a barrel with tar in case he sunk on the way home. But he made it home, and when he got home, he had 20-odd copies printed of what we call the Columbus letter, which described what he found, what he didn't find, what he expected he could find next time, and basically reasons that the crown and the church should send him back. These were then distributed to the couriers of the court and the people around the Pope, and there were about a large number, percentage-wise, survived, because he was going to throw away Columbus's letter. These are printed, though. They're not handwritten. And I once was in Amsterdam with my son Jacob, and this is much more than you asked for, but I was sick and I didn't want to go to Paris, and Jake convinced me we should go. We had an appointment with a third-generation French book dealer who will go unnamed, and I was in an ornery mood, which I can do very often. So we went there, and this is a very famous man who was completely full of himself, although he had done nothing but be born to two great booksellers. And I went in there. In the first room, he had decorative books, and I looked at this, and I looked at him, and I said, what is this? You know, we don't even buy books like this. He says, well, I'll show you the real book. So he takes me in the next room. And in the next room, he had what I would consider a good selection of antiquarian books, mainly European. Some of them were fairly good. Many of them were rebound in the French style, which is disgusting, but that's neither here nor there. And then I said to him one more time, I said, this is a third-generation bookstore. Is the best you can do? So he said, no, I have a safe of things you could never afford. I said, let me see, just educate me. He took me into his father's office, mind you, and opened the safe. And in the safe, he said, look at these. And I saw one thin book in vellum, and this is where intuition helps. With all these fancy French bindings, I reached for the book in old vellum, and I opened up the first page. And I happened, because I failed Latin twice in high school, I'm quite experienced in reading Latin. And I could see this was the Columbus letter. I knew what it was immediately. So I said to him, well, this is an interesting book. He said, do you know what it is? I said, yeah, this is the Columbus letter. He said, well, you can't afford that. I said, maybe, maybe not. what's it worth? So then he said to me, it's worth $1 million. And he was a tricky dude. He was saying it's €1 million. And if I had said $1 million, he would have said, you can't afford it. I told you. So he said $1 million. I said, €1 million, it's a deal. And that's how I got to own the Columbus letter. It's in my favorite collector's collection. He has a fabulous collection, an extraordinary collection, probably the best private library in America.
Wow. Just picking up on the earlier question as well, do you ever purchase something and find it with the intent to sell it and sort of develop an emotional attachment to it, and it's hard to do?
Yeah, I often buy things that I think I'll sell immediately, and sometimes I keep them for right now I have a copy of Shakespeare's poems, the earliest available edition. I say that because technically there is an earlier edition but doesn't exist to our use, which is in an absolutely contemporary Italian binding. And I've kept that book because it's fascinating to me how right away Shakespeare's poems was recognized to go into a great collection in Italy, which put this Italian binding on it. So that's on my shelves. It's the second time I've owned that. I sold it, I bought it, and now I have that. And that's one I'll keep till I find someone who understands the nuances of it, not just I want a Shakespeare, but the importance of Shakespeare at an early date in European culture. That's an example.
I'm not certain this is a question. I think it might be a comment, but it's related to what you just said. When you find someone who has, paraphrasing, the sensibility, so it's not merely a return, an investment return. You also are looking for an appropriate, what would it be, keeper?
Well, the truth of the matter is that long ago I reached the point in my career where I could be picky. If I were a young person trying to make a living in this tough world, I don't know what I would have to do. But long ago, I reached the point where I could be careful where I place my great things. There are some things I give to libraries when they can't afford them because they belong there. But in terms of collectors, I have a superb group of collectors that I've worked with for many years, and most of them understand what I do, and I usually have somewhere appropriate to put them. But when I'm dealing with selling, I make my profit because that's how I make my living, and I'm not embarrassed about it. When I deal with institutions, that's a different situation. There are things that belong in certain institutions. I own, this is another whole story, but I actually owned, this is complicated, the earliest Hebrew writing of the story of Exodus. So you're going to say, what about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, the truth of the matter is there's no such thing as the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are 10,000 fragments of scrolls, and they have all been published, and they've all been organized. And if you study it all, nowhere, even if you took all the different pieces, is there a complete telling of the story of Exodus. So through a bizarre series of events, I was able to buy the earliest Hebrew telling of the Exodus story. And so that's an example of something which had to eventually go to the Museum of Book in Jerusalem. I mean, it's the only place it could possibly go. So my job was to get it there so they'll be happy, my customer will be happy, and I will be happy. So I sold it to a member of the Board of Trustees of that institution who will keep it and eventually get a donation for placing it there. So that's it.
How does that process work? You've mentioned before reaching out to people. You do have a move through an intermediary, or you just establish your own connections?
It's very rare that I need an intermediary. I've been introduced to a lot of people, and I know a lot of people who know a lot of people. I'm trying to think, when's the last time I needed an introduction? Not for a pretty long time. Again, if you have something, all you got to do is write their secretary a letter. I have this or that, but not too much. Mostly I know the people. I deal a lot with the great American institutions in Washington. A lot of our things go there now.
Oh, you looked as though you had a question.
I do have a question. So with all this incredibly rare, valuable material. I'm wondering if you would be comfortable speaking at all about security for those treasures.
Absolutely. 2 stories which will clear that up completely. One, I started in Baltimore, Maryland, where I had nothing. And my store was in a ridiculous neighborhood, but it was big, and I needed to store things. And we used to go do regional book shows. So we used to pack the day before, put it in boxes, and leave it. And the great books, we didn't even put in the boxes, we left them on top, and they're all labeled. So one day we had a break-in. All my books are there. Shakespeare's, Darwin's, everything I owned, and they took my computer. That's the story. Nobody wants to steal a rare book. First of all, people who steal books can't read usually, or aren't collectors. Second of all, there's nothing other than a great painting that's harder to sell than a rare book. The people who collect them are a very small group of people, and we mentioned it in the prelim, but I've been very involved with returning stolen books, and anybody should know. Now, there are dealers who don't care, bad guys, but for the most part, to fence a rare book, you can't go to the guy who takes gold and silver and melts it. You have to find someone who has a market for it. So it's really not a theft issue. As far as taking care of them, the biggest threat is water. More books are destroyed by water than fire by 10 to 1. So when I advise my clients, we have a wonderful book buyer in New York City who I've worked with for 35 years. We suggest you buy watertight leather boxes to keep your great books in, and that will protect them from when your neighbor upstairs moves out, leaves your ice maker refrigerator hooked up, and it comes down to your apartment, which is a true story that happened to one of my great collectors. So that, bizarre things happen, but that's what I recommend. They shouldn't have direct sunlight. It protects against that. It protects against humidity variation, and it protects a front line against catastrophe.
Hello. So as a young person trying to make a living, I wanted to know if you had any advice for someone looking to get into the art market.
For someone what?
Looking to get into the art market after graduation.
What type of art? That's a critical question.
Yeah. I'm casting a wide net at this point in my life.
Well, here's what I would suggest. First of all, find something you love that you'd be willing to live with, because you will. You will, when you begin your business, you're going to live with your money in things, your stock. So pick something you love, but also stay away from the crowds. The crowds will go into things, they'll push up prices to preposterous numbers, and you don't want to buy into a falling knife. So pick something that you think has transcendent value intellectually, visually, or culturally, and something you enjoy, and try to pick something that is not trendy. That would be my biggest advice. And then believe in your instincts. Because if you don't have good instincts, you're going to go out of business. So you might as well believe in them. Does that answer?
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think I had already made this comment to you. Instincts are cultivated, aren't they, over time, and study and mistakes?
Yeah, definitely. Well, you learn as you go, like anything else in life, but you have to, a lot of people have good instincts, but I have an assistant who will go nameless, who's a fabulous bookman. I think he's a better bookman than I am, probably in technical terms. But Jake Zeitlin said something to me years ago. He said, you're going to be successful because you can bet your money and go to sleep at night. And that's a critical part to this world where it's capital intensive. You have to have enough confidence. You buy something, it doesn't sell the first time. Jake used to say, if it doesn't sell the first time, put it away, bring it back a year later, and raise the price.
Other questions? Oh, yeah.
Stephen, I was just going to ask if there's a book that you aspire to that you haven't yet acquired.
There's 2 books in my career that I didn't buy. One of them, I couldn't help it. It turns out, and I felt it, I was bidding in a public auction against a Middle Eastern potentate's sister who was trying to build the library. That book is the first Hebrew printing of the Bible. And I underbid it, bidding more than I could afford, more than my client would pay, because I really wanted, and it's never come back again. That's a very rare book. So that's the one that bothers me the most, I think, in my career. The true Kelmscott, the original Chaucer, the first book printed in English in England. I underbid that in an auction, and that was a mistake. I was bidding against someone that, if it were now, I would have bought it. And I've tried over the years to buy it back. It's owned by the Getty family, and they outbid me. Might outbid the Gettys. But, you know, you'll be amazed if you have the courage of your convictions. You can. I've tried to buy that back for an enormous amount of money from one of my clients, more than I could ever spend, and they won't sell it. So those are the two books that got away from me. And I think someday I'm going to get the Getty to sell. I have a guy who really wants it very, very badly. The Bible, I don't know if I'll ever see it again. That's a truly rare book.
Great. I'm sorry, I was just going to ask, is anybody who has anything to do with books is approached sooner or later by somebody who says, I have a really old copy of Edgar Allan Poe, let's say. Can you sort of appraise it for me, evaluate it?
I do not do appraisals under
But
any circumstances.
It usually turns out to be old means it was printed in 1952 or whatever.
Well, the one I get most often, I don't know if this is what you're referring to, I get calls probably once a year with a copy of U.S. Grant's memoirs signed by Grant, who died before it was published. That, because it's a facsimile on his picture in the book. So I get that with some regularity. So I tell them, take a picture and send it. If it's not the signature I know, you've got a treasure.
So how do you explain to people that there are books that are genuinely very old and maybe quite rare, but they're not valuable?
Very simply, I have a set phrase. Say, that's a family heirloom. You wouldn't want to sell it to me.
That's very kind.
Pass it on to your children.
Yeah.
That's all you can do. You don't want to break their heart. You don't want to disappoint them.
Right.
But, you know, there's an awful lot of Bibles printed. So, you know, people who have Bibles printed in the 18th century, the 19th century, they think it's God's gift to the book world. I say, pray on it.
Yeah.
It sounds like a great book.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know it's 8:30. I feel as though we could go on for a very long time. Notice how I just ignored that comment. Is it the case that now, if one tries to give a collection to an institution, one also has to make a significant donation in order to
No.
take care of that?
No.
No?
It depends how badly they need it or how badly they want it. If you want to give a gift because you want to take a deduction, and it's not something the institution cares about,
Oh,
the processing of rare books or photographic collections has become an enormously expensive issue for institutions.
right.
And most of the time, it's not worth their effort.
Right.
If you have somebody that has, for example, Cornell, I mentioned, I've done a lot there. I've learned from three great librarians. Sarah Thomas was the Bodleian librarian. My friend Ann Kenny was a fabulous librarian. If you look at what they have, that's a Civil War institution. They have to have photography of that. So I built them, sometimes when you look back, it's painful. I gave them 19,000 carte de visites, which are the small photographic portraits. Every one of them a known sitter. We know who it is. 19,000 of them. And now at auction, these things go for $500, $1,000, $5,000 a piece. The collection is totally priceless, but it was where it should go. So, and also, it's 25 years later. Who knows?
Again, I hear you saying this over and over again. It's where it should go.
Certain things have to go certain places. They couldn't put the Bible manuscripts, into I don't even want to say it, I'll offend somebody, but for me, that had to go to the repository of the earliest Hebrew manuscripts. That's how I felt about it. That's an extreme example. There are many things where there are many institutions that should have it. Richard and I have a common friend now who has a fabulous Poe collection that I've helped her build, and then she bought my collection, basically. And then she has fabulous things way beyond what anyone has ever had, I guess since the 1920s. And she's got to decide what to do with it, and every institution would die to have that. So what she's doing is very intelligent. Gradually, she's placing pieces of it with our consultation, sometimes with Richard, sometimes with me, in places where that particular object fits the best. So it really depends on the object and the institution. You want places that have stability. That's a very important thing. Nobody wants to give a gift and then read that it was sold at auction. That's a very bad thing.
Other questions? Once again, I would like to thank everyone who has supported this in various ways, including our audience members. And our, I'll say tonight, 2 guests, but also our 3 experts, because Professor Cody was also significantly involved. So thank you sincerely, Stephan Loewentheil, Richard Copley, David Cody, and everyone here who has contributed in one way or another. I'm really very thrilled, even though it's a modest audience. To quote Spencer Tracy from the film Adam's Rib, not much there, but what's there is cheers. So thank you so very much. I so appreciate your visits, your commentary, and the support from the Institute.